The Gospel reading is from Matthew chapter 13, verses 22 through to 30, 36 to 43. Praise and glory to God. The parable of the wheat and the tares. And let me explain, tares are like a weed that's very akin to wheat. Now he who receives seed among the thorns is he who hears the word, and the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and he becomes unfruitful. But he who received seed on the good ground is he who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and produces, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Another parable he put forth to them, saying, The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. But when the grain had sprouted and produced a crop, then the tares also appeared. So the servants of the owner came and said to him, Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares? He said to them, An enemy has done this. The servant said to him, Do you want us then to go and gather them up? But he said, No, lest you gather up the tares, you also uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at the time of harvest, I will say to the reapers, First, gather together the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. The parable of the tares explained. Then Jesus sent the multitude away and went into the house. And his disciples came to him, saying, Explain to us the parable of the tares of the field. He answered and said to them, He who sows the seed, the good seed, is the Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seeds are the sons of the kingdom, but the tares are the sons of the wicked one. The enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels. Therefore, as the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of this age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and those who practice lawlessness, and will cast them into the furnace of fire. There will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. This is the gospel of Christ. Praise to Christ the word.
Please be seated. Come, God, I ask, in your word and by your Spirit. Amen. I want to share some news before I begin. For those who were unaware, Leslie had been scheduled to have a routine operation about a month ago. A 3-hour operation which turned into a 7.5-hour operation. Some complications, but the good news is that she came out of that and is home recovering. Thank you for your prayers. I have an older brother who is with his family returning from China, where he teaches, to take up a position locally as a principal in one of the schools in Pyro, so I'm glad to have another Wilkinson in the midst to go with the Wilkinson who's just joined the Hauraki Council, and also another Wilkinson who has now become their cultural advisors. Watch out, we're coming. And lastly, I am returning to school. A degree in counselling awaits me beginning tomorrow morning, all done remotely. For the number of people who will cross my door in the office, I can only take them so far in terms of conversation and, of course, prayerfully. But now I have an opportunity to extend that ministry to them. And so I look forward to the excitement, actually, and the challenge of new ministry. Have you ever wondered why It may feel like you are not hearing God as well. Or maybe that you are not experiencing the promises of God that you know full well are yours. In fact, you just know things aren't right. I want to give you some context of today's gospel. We are in the 13th chapter of Matthew, the preceding chapter. We found Jesus in the temple, and it ends with his family waiting for him outside, to which Jesus responds, "They are not my family. If you are a child of God, you are my family." This gospel is full with 8 different parables. 4 were directed to the multitudes. The remaining 4 were privately given to the disciples. This morning's gospel, the wheat and the tares, as Paul mentioned, was a tear, was a weed. In those days was referred to as darnel. The field in the gospel was referred to as the world. The good seed was referred to as the children of the Son of God. The bad, or the weed, the tares, the darnel, referred to as the children of the evil one. Kind of sounds like a cartoon movie, doesn't it? The evil one. If you don't have kids, then you probably didn't catch that one. Well, kids still young enough to watch cartoons. And then the harvest is when the end of age comes, the harvesters, the angels. That's the context of this morning's gospel. An average human can see at least 1 million variations of colours. If you didn't know, I'm colourblind. I'm what's referred to as trichromic, which means I can't differentiate between reds and greens. It's a problem that's generally associated with men. Affects the X chromosome. Of course, only men have that chromosome. If I sound intelligent, it's because I memorised all this to impress you. In my life, the colour blindness affected me consistently. When people talked about the red, yellow and green traffic light, where I lived, they were red, orange and white. That's what I thought. If I were to colour in something in brown, I would first have to grab all the colours that looked brown, turn the page over and draw till I figured out which one was brown. For the most part, I would have to ask for help because I couldn't differentiate. My favourite colour, therefore, is yellow because it's the colour that stands out the most. In my adult life, I can put on a suit or a pair of socks only to be told that they don't match or the socks were a different colour. In fact, this week I looked at a yellow bike online, excited to find it, only to be told it was green. This gospel this morning could ask of us a question. Are we weed or are we wheat? As Paul alluded, the tares, the darnel looked like wheat. They stood the same, they both had ears. The only way you could really tell the difference was once they were ready for harvest, the tares' ears would drop down. That was the only time and the only way that you could find the difference. Sometimes when we do life, we consider ourselves as wheat. We're good wheat. And there are weeds around us, but those weeds belong to the sinful people. They're the weeds. We're the good wheat. David, in our psalm this morning, acknowledged that God knew everything about you and I. He knew when we stood, when we sat. He knew when we lay down, when we rose. Even in darkness, it looked light to him. He was acknowledging that God knew us better than us, to which he proclaims the prayer, "So God, search me and know me. Reveal those things in me that are not of you." In other words, Father, because you know me well, would you show me the things in me that I can't see, things that would hinder you in my life? Jacob, in our Old Testament reading this morning, and if you look at verse 14 of today's chapter, a verse that's omitted in this morning's gospel, it says, proclaiming the words of Isaiah's readings, you can hear but not listen, or you can listen but not hear. You can look but not see, and your heart therefore becomes calloused. If we put all these scriptures together, we can surmise that God has, like he said to Jacob, I promise you and to your generations, I will give you everything that you require. I will be with you always. Like he said to David, I will know everything about you. I will always be with you. As Paul proclaimed to the Romans, that we don't have an obligation to the flesh, but if by the Spirit we put to death the badness of the body, then we live. It would be easy then to determine that we are in fact wheat, we are good people, and we are not weeds. I want to talk about the weeds that we know are there. The weeds that we are aware of, the weeds that we know are present but we choose to ignore. It's like a traffic light that is red, orange and, or is it orange? It's red, yellow and green. But in fact we call it red, orange and white. We know what it is, but we see it as something else. Or we colour ourselves to look one way. In fact, people eventually will start to see us in our true colours. Or we dress up to look one way. In fact, we look eventually completely different to those who are watching us. That's what happens when we have a weed in our life that we know is present but we choose not to deal with. And quite often that then leads into the fact that we know that it's there but ignore it and try to look different to everyone around us. And it would be easy for us to wake up every morning and pray that prayer, Lord, search me and know me and reveal those things that are not of you. A prayer that's not effective if we know that there's a weed there and we choose not to do anything about it. We can't pray that prayer in one hand and then know that there's a weed in our life that we choose to do nothing about. And as we allow that weed to grow in our life, then what eventually happens is what Isaiah reminds us of, that we see, we look, but we don't see. We listen, but we don't hear. And eventually our hearts become calloused. And so for us, in a practical manner, what it means is that over time we are affected in the ability to hear from God. We look like wheat, We look like a brown felt tip or a brown crayon. We look like a traffic light. But over time, those things start to dissolve to the point where we understand when it says our hearts become calloused. And so we no longer hear God the way God intended for us to hear him. And we no longer see the promise that was fulfilled in Jacob and that was promised to us. But we continue to dress the way we dress. We continue to colour the way we colour. We continue to call things one thing when in fact they're another. So what is the answer to the weed that sits in our lives? Number one, we have to stop praying the prayer, Lord, search me and know me, and ignore the weed. We have to begin by acknowledging that there's a weed there. That's the first and most important part. Then, and only then, can we pray effectively, Lord, search me and know me, and reveal that weed that is in me. And Lord, I have no obligation to that weed, but it's only by your Spirit that, Father, you can deal with that weed. And Father, as you deal with that weed, hold me in a place that I will continue to be willing to acknowledge and to allow you to work in that weed in my life. Then you will hear God clearer. And then you will then see the fruits of God that are yours, that belong to you. Are we wheat or are we weed? In God, of course, we are wheat, but it doesn't mean we permit the weeds or reject the weeds from growing. If that's something that you've experienced, it's certainly something that I've been experiencing. Acknowledge that the weed's there before God. That's the first step. Pray the prayer that David prayed. Search me and know me. Call it for what it is. Acknowledge it for what it is. Don't pretend it's something else. And as difficult as that can be, that's the way for many people that they're going to then know the fullness of God, the voice of God in an old but a new way. And when the harvest comes, and when God calls the harvesters, we can stand in account and know that we were able to deal with the weeds that we were aware of.